morning, everyone. How are you? There we go. Zach was just waiting on me to start talking so he could get the sound adjusted on that pad back there. Good to see everyone. Glad you're here on a beautiful Lord's Day. And let me tell you something. Any day is a beautiful Lord's Day when it's the Lord's Day, right? And we can come together as God's people to worship Him together and assemble around the table, as we've often said, to commune with Him through the bread and the fruit of the vine in a little while. We began this study on January the 1st. That's right? Huh? New Year's Day was on Sunday, yeah. And we began talking about church leadership and church leaders. And the first thing we learned in 2 weeks was that if we're going to be leaders for Christ, what kind of leadership does He demand of us? Just like He was, what kind of leadership should we have? Servant leadership. And last week, we, I think, began a new thought. And that thought is what? Anybody remember what we studied? It starts with an S too. Shepherd leadership, right? So if you would, turn in your Bibles to John chapter 10. I want us to look at something that the passage we looked at last week, not for long today, but just to maybe recall a few things, bring to our remembrance what we studied before we build on it today. If you'll remember, we talked about things about sheep, shepherds, the sheepfold, and the door of the sheep, right? We also talked about things like thieves who would try to get in and either destroy or steal, right? Of those things, Jesus has described Himself as not only the shepherd, but a little later on, the good shepherd who lays down His life for the what? For the sheep, right? And He also described Himself as also the what? What does shepherd often do when the sheep were in the sheepfold? He described Himself, I am the door of the sheepfold, because a lot of times a shepherd would lay down in the doorway of that sheepfold to keep anything else from coming in and keeping any sheep from wandering out in the night or when they did not need to be out of that sheepfold. And so a lot of the shepherding imagery is used here. It was very well known in that day and time and had been for many centuries of time. We've mentioned a few folks that we knew from the Old Testament who were shepherds, who were two key people. David was one, and before David, what had another person done for 40 years? Moses. He was in Egypt for about 40 years growing up, and then his young adult life, and then he fled to the land of Midian where he kept his father-in-law Jethro's sheep. All right, so you've got Moses and David. Would you say those were pretty good leaders of God's people? Yeah, pretty good, be an understatement, okay? They were good leaders of God's people. Not perfect, but good leaders. And maybe it was that they learned some of their leadership ability of people because God, in His infinite wisdom, caused them to be what? Shepherds of sheep long before they were shepherds or leaders of what? People, okay? And so the shepherd imagery is very, very, very strong. Coincidentally, one passage that hopefully we'll get to today is the 23rd Psalm. And somebody tell me how that begins. The Lord is my shepherd. Who wrote that psalm? David. Could he speak on that subject? You know, back years ago during the Dale Carnegie courses, a lot of the older gentlemen in the congregation here, when I first moved here, would often talk. Some of them had gone through the Dale Carnegie courses, and they would often say, talking to me as a preacher, you have to earn the right to speak on a certain subject, okay? Had David earned the right to speak on the subject of the Lord being his what? shepherd. He knew it from experience, from what shepherds do, but he also had that walk with the Lord. Now, that psalm is also prophetic, meaning that David is actually writing about and pointing to the coming of who? Christ, who would be the good shepherd, John 10, and the chief shepherd, 1 Peter 5 and verse number 4 or so. Okay, so a lot of tie-ins here with this concept of being a shepherd. I want to point out just a couple of things as we go along that we did not maybe get to last week. Look at verse number 12 of John 10. He's talked about the thieves that come in and try to destroy. We talked about the abundant life, the extraordinary life that Jesus can give as the good shepherd, because he gives his life for the sheep in verse 11. Verse 12, but a hireling, he who is not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and what? Flees. He runs for his life. And the wolf catches the sheep and does what? Scatters them. We're going to look at something in the Old Testament in a passage in just a few moments that's really going to show how there were some shepherds of Israel who did the thing that is said that the hireling does here. Here's somebody that goes out and maybe for a very low wage, they are asked to keep somebody else's sheep for payment, right? And the problem is, because these sheep don't belong to him, he's got no vested interest, doesn't have any strong monetary value in these sheep, he's just getting paid a daily wage, very likely. Is he going to give his life for something that does not belong to him? A hireling won't do that. He's going to flee when the wolf comes. He's not going to lay down his life for the sheep. And then Jesus, of course, building on that particular imagery, he doesn't care about the sheep. Verse 13. Verse 14, I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and I'm known by my own. He then talks about other sheep that he has, talking about the Gentiles. There would be some in Israel who did not hear his voice and follow him, but there would be some Gentiles who would. Skip all the way down now, if you would, to verse number 27. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they what? Follow me. Tell me something we said last week that makes that statement of Jesus kind of true when it comes to shepherds and sheep. What did we say about shepherds and sheep last week that really helps us understand what Jesus says in verse 27? Yeah. You could have more than one flock of sheep in a sheepfold or out in a pasture or in the fields where they would feed, and one shepherd could walk in and call his sheep, and guess what? Only those who were his sheep would do what? Follow him. They only followed the voice that they recognized. And so Jesus is drawing upon that truth and saying, look, you're not my sheep, talking about those Jews in the previous verses there who were mocking and rejecting what he was saying. He said, that's okay. You're not my sheep. You don't believe in me. But my sheep, I know them, and they hear my voice, and what do? They follow me. Okay? And so those are some concepts that we talked about last week. I just wanted to remind us of them before we laid another little foundation, laid a little bit more on that foundation again today. Now, I ask you to read 2 chapters. We've already alluded to one of them today, but 2 chapters in the Old Testament. Anybody remember what those chapters were? Ezekiel 34 and Psalm 23, okay? Let's go to the more familiar one first in Psalm 23. Remember, we're talking about church leadership, which implies spiritual leadership, Christ-like leadership in the church, okay? And so Jesus brought up this shepherding idea. We've looked at it in John. We've alluded to 1 Peter 5, where that word is used again, and that concept. And so let's study a little bit more about this. Okay, Psalm 23, very familiar, no doubt. I've written three things right out beside where it says Psalm 23, a Psalm of David. We have to always remember when we read this psalm that it is from a shepherd's perspective. Okay? It's from a shepherd's perspective. That's plain and obvious. Okay? Secondly, notice the personal pronouns that are used throughout this chapter. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not what? Want. Did David have a personal relationship to his shepherd, the Lord? Yes. And that is the kind of relationship that we each should be striving to develop. And the other thing I wrote down was what I mentioned earlier, that it is prophetic of Jesus, and we see that in John 10, where we just came from. Okay? All right, verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Now, what does that mean, I shall not want? You know, there are a couple of songs in our psalm book based on this, and they are strikingly different in their tune and melody, but basically they have the same concepts that are given here. What does it mean to not want? All my needs are met. He provides for everything. You may want to write down, as I've done, in the margin of your Bible or somewhere, we're going to be looking at about 5 things that are evident in this psalm, what the Lord provides as a shepherd. Okay? Firstly, protection. Protection, provision, healing, blessing, and eternity. Okay? The Lord is our shepherd. And I'm going to mention those a few more times. But the idea of provision is what we're talking about when we say the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I don't have a need for anything. What could I want for? He's provided. Then he explains in verse number 2 why that's true. It is true because he makes me to lie down in what? Green pastures. You know, for years and years, I always thought about how nice it was to go out and enjoy nature, maybe lay down on the cool grass and let the warm sun shine. No, that's not what he's talking about. Why are they blessed to lie down in green pastures? That's good food, right? It's what they eat. And so that was the provision, God providing for their needs. And then he leads me beside the what? Why are they still waters? Say it again. Yeah, they can be skittish of especially rolling rivers. But a still water to lots of animals is what? They protect and safety while they go about to get a drink. The water is another thing that is a provisional need that's met, by God himself, the Lord. Verse 3, he turns this, and really the whole psalm is spiritual, but he restores my what? Soul. Some have seen this as David describing how spiritually the Lord is shepherding, not just as a shepherd would lead in green pastures and in still waters, but now this is how the Lord provides for me, for my very soul. He restores my soul. What does that mean to you? That he restores my soul. When it's That's it. When it's weak, he makes it strong again. You don't know what you said, all right? Okay. Say it again. Gives me hope. If you were to restore a car, what would that mean? Make it like the original. Make it new again. And so what Casey's saying is correct. When I'm weak or when I'm downtrodden in spirit, he restores. He makes new again my soul. He leads me in the paths of what? Righteousness. And as any good Israelite would know, what God does is for His name's sake, right? The Jews were to be a missional nation. In other words, by looking at them and how they followed in God's righteousness, the rest of the world was to be drawn to a knowledge of God. Why? Because it's God who's to be glorified and exalted. And so why then does this Lord, His shepherd, why does He do this for him? Well, it's for His name's sake. It's for the sake of the name of God, to show His power, His goodness, His benevolence, His mercy, all of those things. And so it is for His name's sake. Verse 4, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Womp, womp, womp. That's a dark picture, isn't it? That's gloomy. But even though he paints such a scary picture, one that's of uncertainty, he says, I will fear no evil, no trouble, no thing that's bad. For you are what? Thou art with me, your rod and your staff, they what? Now, how does a rod and a staff of a shepherd bring comfort? He's protected. And so you have provision, He provides, but then He protects. Even with the thing that most human beings are the most scared of anything else in the world, which is what? Death. Okay, sometimes it might be when you think about your own death one day, or when we have to walk through that with the grief of the loss of a loved one. But the assurance is what? I won't be afraid because He is with me. He's with me. I don't know anything about death, but who understands it? God does. Who has the power over it? God does. Okay? And so here is trust in the Almighty, and just like that rod and the staff were used for protection, I'll fear no evil. Why? Even through the worst of times, death, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Yep. He props me up. It's a good thought.
And then the rod is where it's like his, sword where he would, just push away evil or the danger away from him, and that's what God is for us. Like where they explain,
It's good.
Different place about, my God is my armor.
Mm-hmm.
And it just...
That's right. Keeps the evil away. And then another thing, the crook in that staff could also be used to rescue the sheep, to bring them near if he needed to keep them protected, right? Okay, so there's a lot of various things about the rod and the staff there. Verse 5, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. What's he saying there? Is this provisional as well? Yeah. But the last little part of that makes it a little extra special. Why? We've been studying the Psalms on Sunday night. And what happens in a lot of the Psalms that we've read recently? What's David crying out to the Lord about mainly? protection from his enemies. And not only is that protection there and comfort from the rod and the staff, David even receives God's blessing over and over in the presence of his what? His enemies. God doesn't let him be shamed in the presence of his enemies. He does not go away from David in blessing him so that his enemies rise up and shout, his God has left him, he's nothing now, so forth. No. In the presence of mine enemies, he's done this. And then he says, you anoint my head with oil. I've written healing there. Most of you have probably seen something that's gone around the emails and on Facebook some about the anointing of the head with oil. A lot of times with sheep, when they get to rubbing their heads together or on rocks, or sometimes where there are thorns and briars that get hung in that wool and scratch the skin, or if they've been harmed in some way by a predator, then what would be needed to help the healing? You remember when the Good Samaritan ran upon the man in Luke 10 that had fallen in the roadside ditch? How did he doctor his wounds? Pouring in two things. What were they? Oil and what? Wine. Now what does oil do to something, that a wound that has taken place on the skin? What does oil do? Say it again. It keeps the flies out. And it also helps the mending, keeps that tissue what? Tender, so that it can mend again. Okay? It's soothing as well. Yeah. And so all of those reasons is why that would be used by a shepherd. And so when we're battered and scarred, what does our shepherd do for us? Well, he anoints my head with oil. Okay? And then my cup runs over. In other words, the blessing of this healing, it just keeps coming, it keeps coming, it keeps coming. Cup is used in a lot of various ways. Jesus used it as a cup of suffering. You remember this? Father, let this cup pass from me. But folks that study the terminology of that day say that it could actually be a cup of blessing or a cup of goodness or anything positive. It just depends on what's associated with it. When he asked James and John, when they asked for the seats, one on the right and one on the left, he asked them two questions. Are you willing to drink of the cup that I'm going to drink? And then are you willing to be baptized with the what? Baptism that I'll be baptized with. And so this cup idea is one, and look, cup just running over. Cup's running over. I heard a man preach this one time and said, well, they'd had several series of lessons one day at a thing, and it was very uplifting, lots of singing, lots of fellowship. And the last speaker got up and said, well, if your cup's not running over by now, you got a hole in your cup, okay? So sometimes we need to check to see if we have a hole in our cup, if we think.
A cup is a container, and it's referred to as an entity. It's what separates individuals. It's your personal cup. So that's the concept that I get, even when Christ says, are you willing to partake of what I'm dealing with? My cup.
That's it.
My cup overflows.
That's right.
So it's really an analogy to your personal entity, seems like.
Sure. And what David felt was his was what? Just overflowing. Okay? And so verse 6, here's a blessing. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me. That's great blessing as long as that cup running over as well. All of my life. There's the blessing. Goodness will follow me and mercy. And here's the eternity part. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord. How long? Forever. Okay? And so it's looking forward, not just about this life, but in my judgment, to the next life, I believe is the implication there. Okay? So, and we've already kind of tied in this shepherding imagery, it is used specifically in local church leadership to elders or overseers. And if I was an elder or was thinking one day of becoming an elder, I would think through the parts of John 10 about what Jesus said and how Jesus led as a shepherd. I've got a book entitled Lead Like Jesus, okay? Servant leadership, shepherd leadership. I'd also put as a part of my study what is said about the good shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. And see what things about shepherding that are brought out in Psalm 23 that maybe an elder could use as he is tending to and caring for the flock. Peter says, the flock among us, or the flock that is among you. Because that is how, look, of all the things in the world, not tent makers, what? Shepherding. That's what's used to describe the work of elders, in a local church. And so that's what I would be looking at. All right, come with me to, any final thought on Psalm 23?
It just covers everything.
It does.
Spiritual,
Yes.
protection, and the reward.
Yes. Yeah. The physical, the spiritual, the protection, and then the reward in the end, and the blessing that continues to flow when we follow him, the Good Shepherd. Okay? Yes, Janet? I just flipped my page. Let's see. Provision, protection, healing, blessing, eternity. I think that's what they were. Okay. Ezekiel. This time, Casey will come forth and give us the historical background of Ezekiel. Okay. I want to ask this question, and it's going to be important as we get later in the chapter of Ezekiel 34. I want to ask you a question. Who comes first chronologically, David or Ezekiel? Long time before, right? Okay. Just remember that. That's a while, as far as I'm concerned. Of course, 51 years is a long time, as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, that's all I know. All right. Ezekiel 34. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, among the things that anybody aspiring maybe one day to be an elder, and those who are presently elders of whatever congregation that might be, here's another chapter. I'd put a little, if I didn't read it every day, I'd try to read it every other day or every week at least, because God's not happy with the shepherds of Israel, and there's a reason why. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, thus says the Lord God to the shepherds. Woe to the shepherds of Israel who feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the what? The flocks. All right, so if you were going to identify first problem that is mentioned here, what's the problem? The shepherds of Israel were selfish. It was all about what they could get from the flock.
Romans calls it self-righteous.
Self-righteousness. And that's really it. These leaders were practicing self-righteousness and not adhering to the law, not listening to what God had spoken before by other prophets and by Moses and others. Well, they took their position, I guess they saw it as power, and they made themselves fat and rich while they suppressed the people and neglected them. Okay? And so that's the picture here. Verse 3, you eat, talking to these shepherds, the fat, and you clothe yourselves with the wool. You slaughter the fatlings, but you do not feed the flock. In other words, you're getting all the blessing from the flock, but then you're not turning around and doing what's necessary for their survival, okay? Spiritually speaking, I think is probably number one. But when you read the other prophets, were these leaders of Israel also living high on the hog materially speaking, while they took advantage of the widows and the orphans, and they'd sell the poor, Amos says, for a pair of sandals? Remember that? So there was a lot of social problems going on that God was not happy with, the way that the leaders of Israel were treating their own people. And so it was spiritual and also what? Physical and material, okay? Which also makes it a spiritual matter to God, okay? Verse 4. Here's a look. If you were going to pick out one verse in Ezekiel 34 as a leader of any kind, as an elder, whatever, verse 4 would be it, okay? If you're going to circle one to read every day. The weak you have not strengthened, nor have you healed those who were sick, nor bound up the broken, nor brought back what was driven away, nor sought what was lost, but with force and cruelty you have what? Ruled them. Now you sit on that a minute. All the things, and there's about 4 or 5 of them that he mentions here, that would be something that an earthly shepherd would deal with on a regular basis. Okay? Let's start with it. Tell me what a weak sheep is. The weak you've not strengthened. Tell me what it would be like if you were a shepherd of a flock of sheep, and then we'll get to the spiritual thing about the souls of people. What would it mean? What is a weak sheep? Maybe one that can't keep up with the flock. One that's injured even. Okay? Go ahead. Matthew 9:36.
He felt compassion for them because they were distressed and downcast, like
Sheep without a shepherd. Matthew 9:36. The multitude had come out following Jesus. They didn't bring any food with them, and he had compassion for them because they were distressed and downcast as sheep without a what? A shepherd. If a sheep is not getting the nutrition that it needs, just like a person, aren't you and I naturally to be weak if we don't get the nutrition that we need and the exercise and so forth? Well, that's the same thing that's true for this weak sheep. Okay? Miss Gallagher, you had a point as well. If they're not being fed, they're going to be weak. Okay? Just like a child, a human, an animal of any sort. And so what's the spiritual connection there then with Israel? What's the spiritual connection? The weak you have not strengthened. What's the spiritual aspect of that?
It's like guide you, and because again, you know, when a shepherd had, you know, over here where it says you have not strengthened the weak is, you know, the shepherd's job was, I know, you know, the sheep just were scattered everywhere, but his job was to guide them and direct them into the, you know, the, I don't know, called food plot.
To the nutrition. There you go. Yeah.
And this is where, you know, the elders of the shepherd are supposed to take the congregation or the person, you know, to guide them and direct them to the right path.
And they were to do that by what? Teaching and example. What did they have, these leaders of the Jews, these shepherds? What did they have that was supposed to be taught and taught faithfully? You had the law, and what they had at this time of the Psalms and the what? And what prophets they had had. Okay? And so this was to be a teaching, and I would say predominantly it would be a reading of the law and a teaching of the law and a following of the law. When your leaders neglect the teaching of God's law, guess what happens to the flock? they get scattered, well, they're weakened to begin with, right?
Back to the other, if you're feeding on the fat and feeding on the sheep, and you're not feeding the sheep, sooner or later, you're not going to have any sheep.
Sooner or later, you're not going to have any sheep either, right? All right, look at the next thing that he says. Nor have you healed those who were what? So we have the weak, but now we have the sick. All right. Can cows get disease? Can sheep get disease? Yes. Can come from a number of sources, I would suppose, whether it be certain infections or bug bites or whatever things that prey. Sometimes it could be some bacterial something regarding their food. And look, if you have a disease that goes from one sheep to the next, eventually what's going to happen? If it's contagious, it can wipe out your whole flock, okay? Even in that time, did they have certain medicines that they would use to try to help sheep recover from illness? Sure they did, okay? And when that's not being applied, naturally you know what happens to the sheep. Nor have you bound up the broken. They are the ones specifically who've been injured, okay? When they would go onto the rocky hillsides, guess what could happen sometimes? Let's say you have 100 sheep and they're trying to all go up the same impasse. Well, what happens when there's not enough room for all of them? Somebody may get bumped off the rock, right? Sometimes they can actually get their foot hung in the rock, the whole leg stuck down between the rocks, and in an effort to pull it free, sometimes they couldn't do that. I understand their legs coming up this way were not very strong. But sometimes they could injure themselves. Sometimes they were broken bones in that from falls and other things. What's the shepherd for? It's for that purpose, isn't it? To bind up the what? Broken. Look, we love animals today, don't we? Think about your pets. And be honest with you, to a lot of shepherds, these sheep were like their what? Pets. They would even give individual names to many of them, okay? What happens when your cat hasn't eaten in about a day or two, Tracy? Okay, and then what do you do so you can get sleep tomorrow? We go to the vet, right? All right, what happens when somebody has a dog that's sick? What happens when you have a pet that gets bumped in the road and has a broken leg or a rib or something at this point, right? You tend to it. You may not know how to fix it yourself, but you take that pet to someone who does. So, the purpose of a shepherd was to mend what's broken. How does that work for a spiritual shepherd? What is broken with people sometimes? Your soul, all right? Spirit, what else? Your heart. Sometimes people have a broken heart. Can families become broken sometimes? Can marriages be broken? Can relationships between brethren be broken? Is there a lot of brokenness for shepherds to be seeing about? See?
You know, Michael, what you're saying, our pets, our family, so they
Mm-hmm.
feel shepherd thing. Like, we are Christ.
Yep.
We come on back around, church, with the elders, the first thing I say at the time, this is our thing.
Yeah. Right.
Before, I'm closer to a lot of here conversation than I am my own family.
Yeah. Yeah. And the strong desire to help individuals that are weak to become strong. Those who are sick to become well spiritually, sin sick, okay? And those who are broken. Do we live in a broken world? Yeah, to be mended again. Interesting, a similar analogy is used by Paul in Galatians 6 when he says, what is it about verse 2, about the brother overtaking a fault, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness. In the Greek, that word restore literally means to reset a bone that's broken. Anybody ever broken a bone or had a child who has? And sometimes the doctor may say, okay, we can put a cast on it and be fine. But what happens if it is not in the right place anymore? What happens if the break has caused one part of the bone to move away from that? What do they have to do? You ever had it done? You have to set it, right? That's what that word restore in the Greek means in Galatians 6, verse 1 and 2. And so shepherds of God's flock should be all about resetting the bone. In other words, putting it back like it was to begin with. Helping people overcome sin problems, but also other problems that could otherwise be soul problems. You know what I mean? Let me ask you this. If you got a marriage problem, could that result in having a soul problem? Yes. And it also may be indicative of an already existing what? Sin problem. Okay? So not always, but could be. All right? So you have a lot of brokenness in people in the world, and the shepherds are the ones given that task. Nor brought back what was driven away. Yeah, you can I was thinking Luke 15. Jesus, about the lost, 99. Yeah, my bad. All right, so Jesus even used this analogy, right? What man among you having 100 sheep, you know where 99 of them are, but you wouldn't go after the one that was what? Lost. And Jesus knew the ones he's talking to, they had done that. Okay? They're not just satisfied with the 99 where they know where they are, they're safe. No. You go after the one which is lost. As a matter of fact, what I've studied on this before suggests that you take something to sleep on, you take water, you take something to eat, and if it takes you days for a shepherd to find a lost sheep, they would search and look for that sheep until they found it. Either what? They're going to find it. One way or the other, whatever had become of the sheep, dead or alive, that was how intent they went looking for that sheep. So what was Jesus saying his mission was? I've come to seek and to save that which was what? I'm here, and I'm going after every one of them just as intently as I can. Okay? Now, what would be the role of a shepherd in a church today with a lost soul? The text here, driven away, well, one who's just lost, whether driven away or wandered away on their own. What's the purpose of shepherds in a local congregation? Say it with me, church. To go after the one or ones which are what? Lost. That's soul patrol. That's overseer 101. Okay? To watch out for those sick, weakened, lost, broken souls. But then he goes on to say, nor sought after what was lost, but with force and cruelty you have ruled them. They've been scattered as a result. Come down, he talks a little bit about, in the remaining verses there, about how God is going to be a shepherd to his people. He's removing their leaders. There's a lot of good reading. We're not going to have time to deal with the whole chapter today. But come down with me at verse 23. I will establish one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them. My servant, what does your Bible say? David. I thought David was dead. Y'all said David lived, about 400 years before Ezekiel or more. Okay? Is he talking about actual David? Who is my servant David a reference to? I'm bringing my son Jesus to sit on the throne of David. He'll be like David. He'll be a shepherd's servant, okay? And he will feed them, and he will be their shepherd. Verse 24, and I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David, a prince among them, and I, the Lord, have spoken it. again, how important is it that when Jesus speaks in John 10, he says, I am the good what? Shepherd. He is actually showing, again, in a number of ways, one more time, I fulfill what? Prophecy.
David was king over the 90 kingdom.
Not a scattered or divided one, that's right. Yeah, David was king over a united kingdom long before the kingdom of Israel and Judah's divided. Okay? All right, yes ma'am. Okay, anybody have any final word or question?
I've always thought in the story of the 99 and the one sheep, one thing that's overlooked a lot of times, while he's out looking for the one, he had to ensure that the 99 was.
They weren't going to wander off while he was gone. Yeah. You may have heard this before. That parable, story, whatever you want to call it, of Jesus about the 99 and the one 99 safe and the one missing, it may not mean a whole lot to you until you're that one that's missing. Okay. All right. Thank you much. We'll pick up with a little bit more about probably elders and bridging this with shepherds to elders next